From terrible gambits that have barely ever been played, to highly debated main lines with millions of games played, today I'm going to be ranking all 48 gambits that come from the King's Gambit. 48, the Tumbleweed. This comes after black captures, and we now play the move King to F2, which is just horrible. We're not developing a piece, now we cannot castle, and even worse, black can play a check, and we're going to have to lose 2 more pawns after G3. They capture, we cannot recapture because then we would just lose the rook, so instead we have to move the king over, and now they win another pawn. This is horrible, we're down 3 pawns, our king is terrible, and yeah, you should literally never ever play this. 47, the Gamma Gambit. Comes after black captures, and we now play pawn to G3. This is horrible. It's not in the spirit of the King's Gambit at all. They capture, and after we recapture, we're just down a pawn. Our pawn structure is horrible. There's no reason to ever play this. 46, the Orsini Gambit. Comes after they capture, and we now play the move pawn to b3, which is likely the least useful move we could make in this position, because black can just play a check now. We can move the king up, and yes, just terrible. b3 is such an unhelpful move. The bishop going diagonal makes no sense in the King's Gambit, and you're just wasting your time. 45, the Australian Gambit. Comes after they capture, and we play knight to f3, and we get a bit more of a mainliney position. Black plays pawn to g5, we go bishop to c4, and after they push up to g4 here, we don't move the knight, we don't, play castles, we play pawn to h4, which is just such a useless move, because after they capture, the point, I guess, is that we can recapture and there's no check, but that didn't really need to be prevented, and after something like knight to c6, we can try to capture and get something, but a simple queen to f6, we're down a piece for literally nothing, and we just have a horrible position. 44, the Senecaud Counter Gambit. This one's for black, and here we don't accept, we play bishop to c5, white now develops with knight to f3, and here we play the move pawn to g5, which is just, there's no reason at all to gambit the pawn. I mean, they can just capture here now and just completely be up a pawn. They can also capture here now and also be up a pawn, and yeah, it's just completely horrible. Our king side is also now permanently damaged, and there's no reason to be playing this. 43, the Shora Gambit with bishop to b5, comes after they capture, and here we move the bishop, but not to normal square like c4, but instead bishop to b5, which is, it's just a bad square for the bishop because it just allows pawn to c6, so there's no reason to do this, and if we back up the bishop now to c4, then black can play a move like pawn to d5, and yeah, there's just nothing really good going on for us here. Captures, there's no reason to play bishop to b5 at all, and we're already at a massive disadvantage. However, it's not really permanent. 42, the Carrera Gambit, comes after they capture, and we now play queen to h5, and I guess the idea of this move is after like knight to f6 attacking, we can play queen to f5 check, and yeah, we do win the pawn back, but I mean, that's not really how we play in the King's Gambit. You're supposed to, sacrifice the pawn, and after like knight to c6 here, black has 3 pieces developed, we have a queen on f4, and it's just terrible. 41, the Paris Gambit, they will capture, and then we play knight to e2. The point of this move is that after like queen to h4 check, we can play g3 and captures, knight captures, but our king side is just completely ruined here. We're not playing in the spirit of the King's Gambit, and black also has an annoying move like bishop to d6 here, attacking the knight. We already have a horrible position here. At number 40, I have the other Shora Gambit, which comes after black captures, and we now play bishop to d3. This cannot possibly be a good move. At the very least, it is pretty solid. We are defending the pawn. However, now our d pawn is blocked out, and after like queen to h4 check and king over, this is just very bad. Black can play like bishop to c5 and fret and checkmate already, and we are just doing terrible. This move is very, very bad. 39, the Zilbermint's Double Counter Gambit, comes after you play pawn to g5 here. It's just not good. Your king side is now permanently dead, and after they capture, you do have some compensation, I guess, because you can play pawn to d6, and you can get this position, which is not totally horrible, but it is still very bad. This comes after black captures, and you now play queen to g4, making a very direct threat at the f-pawn, but there's just not a good reason to go to g4 here instead of like f3, because this just allows pawn to d5. Now this pawn is attacked, and the bishop attacks queen after like captures. We're not down a pawn here, but black can simply play bishop to e7. Our queen is really stupid in the center, and we just have a very bad position. 37, the Stamina Gambit comes after black captures, and you now play pawn to h4. It's not a terrible move. It does prevent the queen from ever coming to h4, which is a good thing. However, it is a bit slow, it does not develop a piece, and black can counter-strike in the center of a move like pawn to d5, and we're just at a disadvantage here. 36, the Eisenberg Gambit comes after black captures, and we now play knight to h3, which is a very awkward move. It does attack the pawn, but black can play queen to h4 check, and yeah, here we can block the knight, and we get a semi-solid position, but this is a really awkward knight rotation. Black can just develop with like knight to c6, and they already have a large advantage here, because the knight really does not belong in f2. 35, the Basman Gambit comes after black captures, and now we play the move queen to e2. There's just, I mean, what do I even really say about this move? It's not very good. It kind of defends the pawn, I guess, but, I mean, after, like, knight to c6, this move, it just doesn't really help your position at all. The bishop is now blocked out. It's just kind of a useless move. 34, the Rice Gambit. This is a pretty long one, comes out of a main line. They capture, knight to f3, pawn to g5, you play pawn to h4 here attacking, they push up, knight to e5 attacking, knight to f6, bishop to c4 attacking, they sacrifice pawn with pawn to d5, we capture, now they play bishop to d6 to attack our knight, and the Rice Gambit here is to not move the knight away or defend it, but instead to play just castles here, and the idea is after bishop takes, you can now play rook over to e1 and attack the bishop, but first off, you're only really going to get this in a blue moon, and even if you do get this, black can just play queen to e7 here, defend the bishop, and there's actually just not that much. Looks like pawn to d4 works to attack the bishop, but simply bishop takes on d4, and we are actually just losing here. But if you do play this in the way that it's meant to be played, it can be semi-decent. 33, the Paintal-Dankis counter gambit comes after the move pawn to f5 here. And this move just kind of creates some chaos, and because of that, most people actually do not know what to do against this and make a mistake. Like, if they capture an f5 here, this is the way they can get a good position. We'd have to play an awkward move like queen to e7 here, or like pawn to h5, in which case we don't really have a good position. However, most people don't know what to do, and you will get some compensation in return. 32, the Tartakower Gambit comes after they capture, and we just play the move bishop to e2 here. It's not a horrible move, but just why? Why move it to e2 instead of, like, you know, a good square like bishop to c4? And after, like, I don't know, like a check and king to f1, do we have a horrible position here? No, but why bishop e2? Why bishop e2 not bishop c4? There is no good answer to that question. And because of that, this is just a not very good version of the King's Gambit. 31, the Brian counter gambit comes after we capture. They play bishop to c4, the bishop's gambit. We play this check, king moves over, and now we play pawn to b5 here. This is the Brian counter gambit. The idea is after they capture, we've kind of gotten their bishop off of their good diagonal. However, it really gives just white more chances to get back into the game here. 30, the Kiitsuretsu gambit comes after we capture. They play bishop to c4, the bishop's gambit, and here we don't play the check first, we instead play pawn to b5. And this is the Kiitsuretsu gambit. It's basically just a better version of the other gambit. But still, it's not great because they can capture, and it is a little better because we can play pawn to c6 here and attack the bishop. However, it really just once again gives white a chance to get back into the game, and it's kind of sacrificing the pawn back for once again no real good reason. 29, the Solar Zilbermans gambit comes after we play pawn to f6 here. They capture, and here we do not recapture, we instead play knight to c6. And this is actually surprisingly a pretty good gambit, because the idea here is that after they capture, let's say they capture, we can now just recapture, and even though we are down a pawn here, we actually are doing quite well, and in reality, white is going to have no idea what to do against this, and will likely make a mistake early on. The real problem here is that they don't actually have to capture on f6, and if they don't, if they just play like bishop to c4, we kind of have a very, very awkward situation going on here with no real good solution. 28, the Blackburn Gambit, not the Blackburn Shilling Gambit, comes after they capture. We now play knight to f3, pawn to g5, we play pawn to h4, they push up to g4, we move the knight, not to e5 though, to g5, and after h6, this is a bit of a long one, we now sacrifice knight to f7, they recapture, and here we don't capture any pawns or develop the bishop, we play knight to c3. And this move is not horrible. In practice, it actually does very, very well, but capturing a pawn or playing a check would be a much better way to try and get some compensation for the sacrificed knight. Knight to c3 is just not a very forcing move. 27, the Adelaide counter gambit comes after we play knight to c6 here. They go knight to f3, and here we now play the move pawn to f5. Despite the engine not liking this, white actually has to be quite careful. Like, if they capture on e5 here, then we can simply capture on e4. They're already losing because now we're going to get the queen in. Problem is, they can capture on f5 here, and after like pawn to e4, they have a very nice move here, which is knight to e5. The knight is now defended, the queen is likely going to get in, and our position is kind of starting to fall apart. However, here we even still have some good chances. 26, the Salvio Gambit comes after they capture. We go knight to f3, pawn to g5 here, we develop bishop to c4, and after they push up to g4, we move the knight away to e5. We are making a very direct attack on f7, but the problem here is that after like queen to h4 check, king moves over, they can play like knight to h6 here and defend the pawn, at which point our steam kind of runs out and we have to deal with a very annoying king on f1. However, after like knight to c3 here or like pawn to d4, we do actually have a good amount of compensation in return. 25, the Hanstein Gambit comes after they capture. We go knight to f3, pawn to g5, we play bishop to c4, and black develops our bishop to g7, and here we play the move just castles. And normally the move castles is a good move, and here it is not terrible, but the problem is, in these positions, the only way for us to get an advantage is to play pawn to h4 sooner or later, and by playing castles, pawn to h4 is pretty much forever prevented, and so because of that, this is not a horrible option, but it's not really that great either. 24, I have the Breyer Gambit, which comes after they capture, and we now play the move queen to f3. This is a very direct attack on the pawn, and here, even though it looks a bit, brute, it's actually not that terrible. And in practice, we'll play a move like bishop c4, knight to e2, and actually does quite well. 23, the Ross and Schroeder Gambit comes after they capture. We play knight to f3, they go pawn to g5, and here we play the move pawn to d4. Now, in reality, this is a decent move. It does, take space in the center. Pawn to d4 is a good move. However, after pawn to g4, our knight is attacked, and in reality, we should have just developed the bishop or played pawn to h4 first, because now we have kind of an awkward time. Our best try here would be to play bishop takes on f4, and sack the knight on f3, at which point we have a decent position here. However, we don't have the same attacking luster as in something like the Muzio Gambit, and we just kind of have a meh position. 22, the Sorensen Gambit comes after they capture. We play knight to f3, pawn to g4, and after pawn to d4 here, they can play the move pawn to g4. It's the same line, but here we now play the move knight to e5. And here, although the engine does not really like this that much, it does have some pretty good tricky value. The best line here is after queen to h4 check. We can actually just go pawn to g3 here, and after like captures, we can now capture on g4. And here you'll get a decent position with some tricky compensation in return, but still, it's about the same valuation as the Ross and Schroeder Gambit, and still kind of meh. 21, the Mason Kyrgios Gambit comes after they capture, and here we play the move knight to c3. It's not a terrible move. It is developing a piece, which is good, but the problem is after like queen to h4 check, we have to move our king up to e2, which is very awkward. The bishop is blocked out, and because of that, I think it just makes more sense to play something like bishop to c4 first. That way after the check, we can move the king over to f1. This is a lot better, but still, it's not terrible. And we can play like knight to f3 here, potentially attack the queen, and still get a decent position. 20, I have the Giannuccio counter gambit, I think that's how you say it. Here we're going to capture on f4, and after knight to f3, we can play the move pawn to f5. And this is basically a better version of something like the Paintel-Dankis counter gambit. By capturing first, we're going to get a much better position. Like let's say they capture here, we can now play pawn to d5. The pawn is attacked, we have a nice stake in the center. We actually have a pretty decent position here where likely white is not going to know what to do and you'll get a very good game. 19, the Wild Muzio Gambit comes after they capture, knight to f3 here, pawn to g5, bishop to c4, and after they push up to g4, we play the move bishop takes on f7 check, sacking the bishop, and the point here is that after captures, we can now play knight to e5 check. We're getting the knight in, we're going to get the queen in as well, and we're going to have some sort of an attack, and black does have to be careful if they just move over like king to g7 here. They're actually losing after queen takes on g4, it's mate in 9. So there is some tricky compensation, but if they do know the move, king back to e8, queen captures, and now knight to f6. We're just down a piece for little to no compensation. However, they still have to be very careful, and it's hard for them to find this line if they don't know it beforehand. 18, the Willemsen Gambit comes after they capture, and we now play the move pawn to d4. It's not horrible, but it's also not too great either. It once again allows the check, and we'd have to play the awkward king to e2 now, but getting the 2 pawns in the center is good. There's now additional pressure on this, and after like knight to f3, we can once again get a pretty good position, even though the king's on the awkward e2. 17 is the Algiero Gambit, comes after they capture. We play knight to f3 here, they go pawn to g5, pawn to h4, and after they push up, we actually play the move knight to g5 here. And the point of this gambit is after like pawn to h6, we're going to gambit the knight on f7. And here, this is likely one of the best scenarios where we sacrifice the knight on f7. And after like bishop to c4 here, black does have to be very careful not to lose on the spot with some queen takes on g4 and castle's business. But if they do know the move, which is pawn to d5 here, bishop takes, and now king to g7, the pawn is defended, and black is most likely going to survive. However, we are still going to get a pretty decent attack in return, if not dubious. 16 is the Ghulam Qasim Gambit, comes after they capture. We play knight to f3, pawn to g4, and after bishop to c4 here, and they push up to g4, we actually just play the move pawn to d4 here. And it's not horrible. After captures, we are going to get a lot of compensation in return. We have a large center, and our bishop and queen are going to line up here. However, it is basically just kind of a worse version of the Muzio Gambit. Castling would have been a more useful move, however, we do still have a pretty good position here. 15, the Miles Gambit, comes after we play the move pawn to d5 here, the Volclus counter gambit. They capture on d5, and here we actually don't push up or capture, we play the move bishop to c5. And this is another gambit where the engine really does not like it, however the win rate shows that black actually scores very, very well here. If white just plays a move like knight to f3 here, then we already are doing very well. After pawn to e4, the knight is going to be forced to move, then we can get our queen in potentially. We're actually doing very well. But they can just play a move like knight to c3 here, delay any capturing business, and in the end, we're probably not going to get a ton of compensation in return. However, we are still going to get a pretty good position. 14, the Lopez Gionoshio counter gambit, comes after we capture. They play bishop to c4, and now we strike in the center with pawn to f5. This is one of the best situations of where we play this move. The idea here is that if they capture, we actually have a very nice move, queen to e7 check, king will likely move over, and now we have the nice pawn to d5. And for example, after like captures, we can now play knight to f6, attack the bishop. If it just moves, then now we can play knight to c6. We're going to win the pawn back, and we're actually going to get a pretty good position out of this that once again, white is likely not going to know what to do against and will likely blunder. 13, the Charoset Gambit, comes after pawn to d5 here, the Volclus counter gambit. We capture on d5, they push up to e4 now, we play pawn to d3 attacking, knight to f6 defending, and after captures, we play the move queen to e2 here. The point here is we are attacking the knight, and we are gambiting the d5 pawn. However, if they capture, we're just going to get a good position after knight to d2. They have to play pawn to f5 here. There is some good tricky value, like if they play bishop to f5 here to defend, we're actually winning after pawn to g4. The bishop must move, and we're actually doing very, very well. We're just winning. But if they do find pawn to f5, we can then capture, let's say pawn captures, and then go bishop to e3. We actually get a pretty good position out of this. It is a little awkward because our bishop is still blocked out, however, we are doing quite well. Number 12, the McDonald Gambit, comes after captures, knight to f3, pawn to g5, bishop c4, and after they push up attacking the knight, we go knight to c3 here. We get another pretty similar gambit where we sacrifice the knight on f3, and here we get a good position. Developing the knight first is likely good because now we have additional tactics. of potentially moving it into d5, and we also have all the same ideas of castling, potentially capturing, and then, some f7 business, and we once again have pretty good compensation in return. Number 11 is the Philidor Gambit, comes after captures, knight to f3 here, pawn to g5, and after bishop to c4, black develops bishop to g7, and now we play pawn to h4 here. And this is a pretty good move, but the problem is black can play the move pawn to h6 now because we didn't play it on the move prior. And now if captures, this trade does not really benefit us that much, and we just kind of have a decent but kind of meh position. Instead, playing pawn to h4 on this move would have been better because now they cannot play pawn to h6 here, just captures. They cannot recapture, so because of that, it doesn't make that much sense. However, still, it's a pretty good move. 10, the Quaid Gambit, comes after they capture, knight to f3, pawn to g5, and here we actually develop the other knight to c3 here. And the reason this is actually a pretty good gambit is because of one very common trap. After like a g4 here, we can move the knight into e5, attack the pawn, and after they play a check, this is falling to the trap. However, it is very common because after g3 and captures, we capture on g4. And what so many people do in this position is play pawn to g2 check, allowing queen takes and pawn takes, promoting the queen. And even though we are down a rook here, we can play the move queen to h5, and these various tactics on f7 actually give us a pretty nice advantage. And because of that, this is actually a quite good gambit. 9, I have the Bishop's Gambit after captures, and now bishop to c4. There are a lot of lines here, but the overall gambit is pretty good. The problem here is basically just this check, and we can move our king over. And in these lines, we do decently well. We are going to play knight to f3 and attack the queen. However, recovering from king over to f1 is going to be pretty hard in the long run. And even then, they can still play some other moves other than the check, like pawn to c6 now, and immediately go for d5. And yeah, we are doing pretty well here. However, there are some better lines. For 8 through 6, I have the normal Mutio Gambit, the double Mutio Gambit, and the triple Mutio Gambit. They all come after captures, knight to f3, pawn to g5 here, bishop to c4, and after pawn to g4, we simply castle. And the idea here is that after captures, we actually have overwhelming compensation in the form of this very strong battery, and our king actually being quite safe castled. That is the normal Mutio Gambit. However, the double Mutio Gambit comes after queen to f6 now, and we play pawn to e5, and after captures, we now go into triple Mutio Gambit with bishop takes on f7, captures, and pawn to d4 now. And after captures and bishop to e3, these lines are absolutely wild. First off, they cannot capture the bishop because queen takes and they are pinned. And even though the engine does not like this because we are down 7 points of material, black must tread extremely carefully to not lose on the spot. And because that is actually quite powerful. At number 5, I have the Volclus counter gambit, which comes after pawn to d5 here. And the reason this is good is less because it's actually a gambit, but more so after captures on d5 and we take on f4, this transposes into the modern defense, which is one of the best ways to counter the king's gambit, and as such, I can't really place it any lower. It is quite a good defense. At number 4, I have the Polario gambit. You've seen this quite a lot. Comes after captures, knight to f3, pawn to g5, and here now bishop to c4. The point of this is we are almost certainly going to sacrifice the knight on f3, and we are putting pressure on f7. However, its brother, the move pawn to h4, does prove to be slightly better in more practiced play. 3, I have the Rubinstein counter gambit, comes after bishop to c5, the classical variation, knight to f3, pawn to d6, and after c3 trying to go d5, we can play the move pawn to f5 here. The good thing about this move is that 1, the pawn is defended, and 2, this move occurs in literally less than 3% of games here. Nobody's going to know what to do against this, and they're still going to have to navigate a lot of tricky paths where they're going to play knight to f6 here, castles. We are doing very well. 2, I have the Burden Gambit, which comes after they capture, knight to f3, they play bishop to e7, going for this check here. We actually don't care, we just play bishop c4, they check, pawn to g3, this is the Burden Gambit, they capture, castles, they capture again, and here we don't even recapture, we just play king over to h1. And this is pretty ridiculous. We're down 3 pawns here, however, it's pretty much entirely sound. The idea here is there are so many bishop takes on f7 and then knight coming to the center tactics. Black has so many ways they can go wrong, and nobody knows what the critical line here is, and if they do know it, which is pawn to d5, then after captures, knight to f6, after knight takes on h4 here, we actually still have a pretty good game. But even to get in this position is really rare, and you're still doing quite well. And coming in at the number 1 spot has to be the Kieseritzky Gambit. Comes after captures, knight f3, pawn g5, pawn to h4, pawn moves up to attack the knight, and we move the knight into the center with e5. The thing that is so good about this move is that we are counterattacking the g4 pawn. And we're almost certainly going to win it. Like if they play pawn d6 here attacking, we can simply capture. We're already doing really good here. And if they try to hang on with, let's say, pawn to h5, then now we play bishop c4, and we see the other idea, the f7 pawn is attacked. Black would have to play an awkward move like rook to h7 to defend here, and then we can just play a move like pawn to d4, the pawn is attacked, and we have a really good King's Gambit position, even though this is the main line. Alright, well thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you have a fantastic day. Comment down below what opening I should do next, as well as if you have any other King's Gambit variations that I missed here, comment them down below. I'll rank them in the pinned comment, and I hope you have a fantastic day.